Hi everyone, this is Will O'Toole for Park Ridge Sports History, welcoming you to another edition of the program where we talk all things sports and focus in on the history of the games, players, games themselves, and the sports. This week with a heavy heart, but also I'd like to do a real tribute to two great Baseball Hall of Famers who recently passed, one being Tom Seaver. There's Tom, baseball card from 1970 and 1980, of course with the Reds, we'll talk about that in a little bit. And of course, the great Lou Brock. I found a picture of Brock from 1971, his baseball card. Never had this one, of course, always wanted it, but one of my favorite Brock cards happens to be this one from 1970. Take a look at this one. Kind of a strange one. It's like he's up against the fence there. These 1970 cards, it was a strange collection. It was a kind of a cool collection because it was very, very strange with some of the poses of the players. As I showed you in past episodes, I have that one of Hank Aaron. He's not even swinging a bat or catching a ball or even throwing the baseball. He's kind of in the dugout juggling a couple of baseballs. I love it because, as I said, it is unique. Usually the players have the bat in the hands. But this Brock one, I never had this one. I didn't have that 71 one as well. But I do like it. It is at Busch, strangely enough. Many of the pictures that were taken for the Topps baseball cards are either in Yankee or Shea Stadium because the headquarters of Topps baseball cards are right in Brooklyn. So it was just easier to take photographs of the players when they are at Shea or at Yankee Stadium. But the one I really wanted to focus on was this one, I'm going to say that's 1964. And that's Brock in the Cubs uniform. And I bet you, and I'm not a baseball collector, I wouldn't be surprised if that fetched quite a few more dollars than Brock in the Cardinal uniform, simply because there were probably only 3 or 4 Brock cards issued with him in a Cub uniform. I do love that Cub logo. If you joined me last week, you know I spent the hour or 40 minutes talking about the different logos in football, and I plan to do that later in the year on baseball logos, probably during the Hot Stove League in February, when we're waiting for next year's 2021 opening day to arrive. But there he is. Funny thing is, and I'm going to probably spend the first 15 minutes or so talking about Brock. Did the research with Brock. I felt that the Cubs only gave him really a cup of coffee. You know, he came up in 61 at the very tail end of the season. And why I think the Cubs unfortunately gave up on him was that I think that they thought they had a plethora of outfield talent and they could probably use him as trade bait to get another pitcher, which they did in 64. But if you take a look, and of course I use either Baseball Almanac or Baseball Reference as for my stats, he comes up in 61, only gets 1 hit. His very first hit, though, interestingly enough, and this should have given the Cubs some ideas, his very first hit was off a future Hall of Famer, Philadelphia pitcher Robin Roberts. Actually, the first game, and I did a quick study, so I apologize if I'm technically wrong, but in one of his first games, or in his first game, Brock came in as a pinch runner. Okay, great way to be baptized into the league, but they never used him to steal the base or to attempt to steal. Now, this was a Cub team. If you take a look at their lineup, even at the very end of a season in which they were tons of games, there were at least 25 games under 561. They didn't even bother to use Brock all that much. He played only 11 games, and as I said, 1 game was as a pinch runner. So now he's down to 10 games. Just throw him into the game. He's used in 62, 63, and 64. He plays a number of games, but really, the Cubs, I think there is like almost a new metric, and you can really tell a player through the first 500 games. And of course, technically speaking, the Cubs didn't give Brock 500 games. But he had talent there, and why I think the Cubs, it's probably their greatest trade mistake in their history is that at the time, and I've said this in past episodes, Cubs actually had on their roster 5 future Hall of Famers. Now, this I'm looking backwards, of course, on this, but if you're the Cub management, obviously you see something in Ernie Banks, 2-time MVP. You know he's going to be a Hall of Famer. True, he was probably a little bit past his prime when Brock comes up in 61, but nevertheless, he's one of the best players in the league. He moves the first base. They have a young Ron Santo coming up. He came up actually after Brock. You have the 61 Rookie of the Year in Billy Williams manning the outfield. I believe he played right and left. And you have Ferguson Jenkins, who you are eventually going to get in a trade with Philadelphia. So they could have had 5 future Hall of Famers on their team. As it was, they had 4 at any one time. It's amazing. And then they deal Brock away. Funny thing is, I've looked at Brock's stats. You know, Lou had 21 home runs one year. I know he had really good power. How do I know that? Well, he's one of maybe 2 or 3 players, tops, that hit the ball out of the Polo Grounds. But he didn't use the Mel Ott right field fence to do it. No. Brock hit it into center field. That's where he hit the ball out of. One of like 2 or 3 to hit a home run to dead center field at the old Polo Grounds. Now, for those of you who don't know the Polo Grounds was the place that the New York Giants played, and of course, it's probably the most famous for being, and center field for being the place that Willie Mays patrolled when he was a New York Giant, and of course, it's the site, that deep center field, that Mays made the catch, which is still regarded as the greatest defensive play in baseball history. And if you ever see the video of that, Mays turns his back. He turns his back to the diamond and races down. Unbelievable over-the-shoulder catch of Vic Wertz's drive in the 54 World Series with the Cleveland Indians. It basically was probably the turning point in that World Series. I know the Giants were winning at the time. They did allow a run on the play, but the unbelievable part of that play is not so much Mays making that catch, but that he spins and turns and throws the ball back to the diamond. Incredible play. Now, think about it, because I don't want to go off on one of my favorite players, Willie Mays. I want to get this back to Brock. Brock hit the ball into deep center field over the wall out there at the Polo Grounds. That's incredible power. That's not, let's say, lightning strike in a bottle. How do I know that? Well, he does hit 21 home runs for the Cardinals later on in his career. And I've always thought he had some pop in his bat. He was one of those guys. He was not a slap hitter. He's more a gap hitter. Could hit the doubles, always got the triples, but those triples weren't legged triples. It wasn't like he was able to use his terrific speed, as always, but that they weren't speed triples. They were power triples. And, of course, Brock has the highest batting average in World Series. He played in 3 World Series, all went 7 games, hit quite a few he also hit quite a few home runs in the World Series. Let's say more than you expect for, let's say, what was considered, let's say, a nickel dime hitter or just a gap hitter. So he hit 391. He had 14 steals in 21 games. Brock really moved up his game a notch in the big contests. And you have to remember those Cardinals of the early 60s were really good. And perhaps Um, from what you can tell, it seemed like they took a turn, then the Dodgers took a turn, and the Giants were always there. I mean, the Giants do win in 62, but it seemed to be those three in the National League in the 60s were the three beasts, and that almost like they took turns. Of course, you had the Dodger teams led by Koufax and Drysdale that were just tough to beat. I mean, basically, when you think about it, Koufax at that time was giving you a win every 3-4 days. Incredible. But the Cardinals in the 60s had guys like, I'm going to save this guy for last because I'll use him as a segue. You had Brock and Curt Flood. Curt Flood was a very good player. And had he not been involved in the politics of the game, but had been allowed, of course, you know, he's fighting for the free agency of the players and all the rest of it, but Flood was a very talented player, probably along the same lines as Brock, probably a better defensive outfielder than Brock. He manned center field, Brock left, but that's not a slight against Brock as much as just telling you the kind of talent that the Cardinals had in the outfield. Plus, they had a young Bobby Tolan who was coming in and out there. And the Reds knew that how good a player he was because they traded for him. So that Cardinal outfield was very good in the 60s. Plus, they had Bill White playing first base, at least in 64. And then they go out and they get Orlando Cepeda in 67, who wins the National League MVP, coming over, ironically, from the Giants, who also had 5 future Hall of Famers in the early 60s. Problem with the Giants, they just had a flood of the same type of player, no pun intended. It was a logjam either at first base or in the outfield because you had Cepeda and McCovey manning first base. They would push Cepeda to the outfield. You had Mays, of course, manning center. You had a young Gaylord Perry and Juan Marichal on that team. They had 5, but at least they win a pennant, unlike the Cubs. But Cepeda comes over. And in 68, of course, they lose to the Detroit Tigers in a dramatic 7th game. The Tigers were led by Mickey Lolich and his 3 wins in that 68 series. And that actually came down to a late inning. Actually, Flood, quote-unquote, misplayed a fly ball. He actually slipped on a wet surface. I always thought he got crushed on that. He just slipped, kind of like Mays in 73 when he slipped on a wet surface in the outfield in Oakland. But Brock was on 3 great pennant-winning teams with the Cardinals. Never was able to get back there again. Cardinals were always missing some components in the 70s. Good enough, but not great enough to get over the top. But Brock was probably a mainstay of those teams. Ironically, Brock gets his first hit, like I said, off Robin Roberts. He gets his first home run in 1962. Actually has a great game in 62 when he gets a home run, a triple, and a stolen base in an extra inning battle. And he helps the Cubs win the game. His first steal comes off Ray Washburn. Actually, his first home run is off Ray Washburn. The reason I said is that Ray Washburn is in the record books because he and of course, he pitches a no-hitter for the Cardinals in 1969. And actually, he throws a no-hitter the very next night that a San Francisco hurler throws a no-hitter the previous night. I'm pretty sure. I'm trying to think. Now, of course, I'm having a brain lock. I actually think that might have been Perry, but I doubt it. But they threw back-to-back no-hitters, and that's why I brought up Ray Washburn. He surrenders the first home run in Brock's career. Brock also sets the mark for most steals. Of course, he broke Maury Wills's record, who broke Ty Cobb's record. And, of course, Brock's record was broken by Rickey Henderson. I actually think that Henderson's mark will not be broken for quite a few years from now, simply because baseball's changed so much. It's become a glorified wiffle ball game. And we can talk about that in later episodes, but it's basically a walk, home run, or strikeout in today's game. And that's not because of the defensive alignments. I think that's terrific. That's the game evolving. And it's now up to the players to figure out, gee, should I start hitting the opposite way? Or can I do something to disrupt this defense so they play me more honestly? For the most part, only Ted Williams, 344 lifetime, can beat the Boudreaux shift. And I'm sure that even if he suffered with the defensive alignment that the Cleveland manager and shortstop great had brought into the game, I'm sure that Williams would have gone more to left field at Fenway Park and probably made even more use of the big wall. That being said, the game has changed that way, but Brock with his steals really invigorated the game with those steals. You have to remember in the 70s, the great big red machine was built not just on power, but speed. And, it wasn't just speed on the base paths, it was speed in the outfield as well. And I think those players of the 60s who manned the outfield, the Brocks and the Mazes and the Aarons, with pretty good speed himself, but they brought a different mindset about, if I throw, if I pitch the ball and it's hit to the outfield, I know Mays is going to catch the ball. I know that Brock is going to get near the ball. Now, as I said, Brock, I don't believe he ever won a Gold Glove, but he did his job, and he wasn't a bad outfielder, wasn't a bad defensive outfielder. So Brock, with his steals, and this is the thing, the funny thing, I think that if he had concentrated maybe a little less on the steals and more on his power, man, you would have seen a guy maybe hitting 15, 16 home runs on average a year and maybe driving more runs. Now, the Cardinals did, for the most part, bat him leadoff. I know that in 71, they did they hit him third in front of Torrey every once in a while. But if you take a look at Brock, you say, wow, this guy would have been a great number 3 hitter. Because he didn't really draw a lot of walks. And as I said, he had gap power. And definitely he had power. But I think he may have sacrificed the power for the speed a little bit. I don't know. It's a great debate. But Lou Brock passed away. Ironically, his last attempt to steal, he was caught stealing. Ironically, it was by John Stearns of the New York Mets, who had been inserted into the lineup. He replaced Ron Hodges as the catcher in the game. But the Cardinal great was nabbed in his final attempt to steal a base. How ironic. Of course, his 3,000 hit is off Dennis Lamp. And his last hit, I believe, I'm just going to take a look. His last hit, I believe, I don't have his last hit, but his 3,000 hit was off Dennis Lamp. Oh, no, I'm sorry. His last hit was off Neil Allen. And in 1979, his last year at the age of 40, he hits 304. Incredible. I apologize. I did know that it was Neil Allen. Let's go to Tom Seaver. And of course, I have him. Here's the interesting thing about Tom Seaver. I saw this as a baseball card, but I also saw this one. All right, here he is with Nolan Ryan, 1967 rookie stars for the New York Mets. But take a look at this. Topps also had 1967 rookie stars. It's Bill Dennehy. Now, Bill Dennehy, he winds up going to the Senators. In fact, I think he started out his first 3 games with the Mets being 0-3. Actually, I think Dennehy was part of the whole package to get Gil Hodges to the Mets from the Washington Senators. But let's just take a look. Oh, here's what else I love. This is definitely the 1968. Does everyone see this? The 1968 baseball card. I just love that wooden look of the borders, that surround the picture. And of course, what I used to love as a kid, I used to love that trophy that they used to put up there for Rookies of the Year or Cy Young or MVP and stuff. Just a little extra added incentive for the players to have that little trophy there on their baseball card. But Tom Seaver, great pitcher. I think that if you were to do just if you had a baseball fan and you said, all right, just one player that you can identify with a particular franchise, Seaver would probably be the player that would be selected the most by your buddies for one particular team. Why I say that? Maybe Ruth for the Yankees, but maybe you might get some people who say Gehrig, and the only reason or DiMaggio, or Mantle, or Burrow, and the only reason I say that Ruth might be that way is because of the saying, of the thought that you're tying one player to one franchise. Seaver, of course, is dealt by the Mets in 77 to the Reds, where he wins. He has a couple of years where he wins 20 games, plus he has his no-hitter there. Of course, every Met fan probably remembers this guy's name more than they do second baseman Ken Boswell, and that's Jimmy Qualls, who, of course, ruined Seaver's perfect game. But I also think that many Met fans still see that game as the perfect game. It's the perfect imperfect game. And actually, the fact that he didn't throw the perfect game probably makes it more of a story than that if he did pitch the perfect game. And at least it keeps Jimmy Qualls in the minds of players or in the minds of fans. Jimmy Qualls was basically out of baseball within the next year of playing, but at least he has that moment in Major League. Hey, it's more than I ever had, and I would take it. And I'm sure that there's probably 150 million baseball fans out there who would at least take that moment in history, in baseball history, to at least say, I played Major League Baseball, to be Jimmy Qualls. So there's no, it's not a knock against Jimmy Qualls as much as, wow. And that happens. Actually, the funny thing is, I remember this, and I didn't do a statistical breakdown of this, but apparently Tommy Hutton was the guy who gave Seaver the most trouble as a hitter. He hit over 400 against Seaver for some reason. It was kind of like what Weaver realized with Mark Belanger and Nolan Ryan. Ironically, a contemporary and also a teammate of Seaver was that Mark Belanger, for whatever reason, had an incredible batting average against Nolan Ryan, to the point that Weaver would insert him sometimes first in the lineup if he knew that Ryan was going to be on the mound that night. Here's one of the great pictures I thought, and this is, I think, really is the quintessential picture of Seaver. And I know my ardent baseball fans would know it, specifically Met fans, and that is the dirt that you see on his knee. And of course, he's positioned with Jim Palmer. Two very unique pitching windups, and both three-time Cy Young Award winners. Both started Palmer started a couple of All-Star games, but they were actually the All-Star starting pitchers in the 70 game at Riverfront that was managed by Gil Hodges in 1970. And Seaver and Palmer were the pitching matchups that night. That was the game that goes 5-4 into extra innings. And, of course, Pete Rose with his signature bang, bang slide of Ray Fosse. People don't realize it, but Yastrzemski was the MVP of that game. 4 hits, played the whole night. I tell you, it's amazing. And I warn you, if this is the first time, I can rattle off the stats every once in a while, but I kind of go in different tangents. I know this is about Seaver and Brock, but these are things that if you were sitting talking to your buddies in a bar or in a restaurant, you'd start talking about one thing and then something else would click and say, hey, you remember this, you remember this, remember this. But with Seaver, and I don't understand this today, I don't know why more players or more pitchers aren't being taught almost like the Seaver way. It was a compact pitching style. It used both his legs and his lower torso. I think it probably relieved some of the pressure and stress on the pitcher's arms. How do I know that? I will, because Seaver basically had an injury-free career. I know that in 1974, he kind of had a down year. He only finished 11-11. And they say he was injured that year. But I don't think it was necessarily arm troubles. But that pitching motion, and as kids, if you saw that the knee was dirty and he just came into the game, and you saw that Seaver's knee was really dirty, you knew that, 1, Seaver was having a good game. 2, more than likely he's winning. Number 3, it was late in the game and he was shutting the door down on his opponent. And I used to just love that Seaver motion. I wish it were taught today with the pitchers. And I think actually there would be far fewer injuries on their arms. Just to give you an idea of Seaver, 311 wins. I have statistical breakdown. I don't mean to turn my back to you or anything. Do you realize that Seaver, I was looking at this, he actually faced 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I did a statistical breakdown of all the pitchers and his pitching record. He faced over 25 pitchers who were either Cy Young Award winners or future Hall of Famers. His record, now I'd love to see what his standing is in relation to the other pitchers, especially contemporary pitchers of the time. Seaver was 50-40. And of course, this is unofficial. I may have made a mistake one way or the other, but I'm almost sure, going over this and going over it and going over it, Seaver was 50-40 against either Hall of Fame pitchers or Cy Young Award winners. And the reason I bring that up, he faced a guy named Mike McCormick, the 67 Cy Young Award winner. He also faced Juan Marichal. He actually beat him. Actually, the interesting thing is, when we were kids, you always thought that the ace met the ace each time that they went into a city. And this really shows you that when you do the statistical breakdown, even with using the 4-man staffs of the 60s and early 70s, that really wasn't the case. That there are far fewer times that Seaver met the ace of a staff than he did, let's say, the number 2 or 3. And then you start to think, maybe if Seaver was the number 2 and not the ace of the staff, and that if managers, let's say, almost surrendered a game to the ace of the opponent so that we would have a win here, you wonder whether Seaver's stats would be higher or if teams would do far better in terms of the standings. But anyway, Seaver was 50-40 against either Hall of Fame pitchers, and I'm going to give you a list of the Hall of Fame pitchers, or future Cy Young Award winners. Against Rick Sutcliffe, who was the Cy Young, he was actually 0-4 with 1 no decision. And of course, his no decisions, he was about 500 in those. with the no decisions. So he gave enough, let's say, I shouldn't say he always gave an effort, but he pitched well enough that he allowed the Mets to win more games than they lost with the no decisions. But Phil Niekro, 4-5 lifetime. Amazingly, he met Fergie Jenkins only 3 times in his career and was 1-2. And as I said, he pitched against Marichal. He had 2 no decisions, and he does beat the great San Francisco pitcher 1-0. The reason why I brought in the Cy Young and future Hall of Famers is that Marichal was probably denied a couple of Hall of Fame, not Hall of Fame. He was denied a Cy Young. It always seemed that when he won 25, Koufax would win 27. And a year where, let's say, Koufax was out of the game like 67, and we had mentioned this, McCormick winds up winning 22 games for the Giants, and Marichal wins only 14, even though he has really statistically, and I'm sure the metrics would prove this out, he probably had the better numbers than McCormick. But because McCormick had the 8 more wins, he wins the Cy Young. And really, McCormick's career went downhill after that Cy Young. But Gaylord Perry, 3-2. He also, I believe, faced Bob Welsh, not a Hall of Fame, Cy Young Award winner. He had 27 wins in 1990. But the 2 big guys he faced the most were Don Sutton and Steve Carlton. And Carlton, he won his first 9 decisions, something like that, and winds up 11-3 against the great Philadelphia pitcher. Very similar in terms of circumstances in this respect. They're both 3-time Cy Young Award winners. They both pretty much do most of their pitching in the NL East. They both lead teams to their first to their first World Series title. Of course, Carlton in 1980 with the Phillies, and the Mets with Seaver in 69. They also win over 300 games, and then they spend the last vestiges of their career toiling. Well, I shouldn't say toiling, but pitching in the American League. Seaver actually had not a bad career in the American League. You got to remember that the Mets blew that 84, allowing Seaver to go because they never thought anyone was going to take Seaver. And the White Sox said, we'll take him. Well, he won 32 games for the White Sox over 2 years, including his 300th win over the Yankees. And it's interesting because many Met fans will say, hey, if only if the Mets had Seaver on that 84 squad, who knows? Maybe they win the NL East. And maybe they do. But it did open up a spot for Dwight Gooden. So you don't know. But he actually pitched against Mike Cuellar, but not in the American League. He pitched against him in the National League. He's 1-1. But interestingly enough, there was one point, and I think it was the 73 season. I did put it on my Twitter. Seaver actually faced, in succession, Gibson, Jenkins, and Carlton. And I believe, let me just check. I think it was the 73 season, but he faced them in succession. And he never did that again. But he faced 3 pitchers in succession who were all Hall of Famers. And it started out the year. 1973, when he goes 19-10. Seaver faced Carlton, Gibson, and Jenkins as his first 3 starts in April of 73. Comes out of it 2-1. The interesting thing is he faces 2 past Oriole pitchers in Pat Dobson and Ross Grimsley. And the interesting thing is they are both 20-game winners in their career. So Seaver really, even though I said that it was rare that he was facing maybe the Marichals and the Gibsons and all the rest of it, he did really take on the best of the opponent's staff in many regards. In that 1969 season, and I'm just rummaging through this, when I tell you I have a whole list of all the things, I never realized this, but he starts out pretty well. Seaver actually on July 9th is 14-3. And he finished the season 25-7, so he goes 11-4. Now, it's kind of a downer, you think, but not really, because he actually wins. He was 16-7 at one point in early August, and he wins the rest of his games. He wins 10 straight. He has one no decision in that game against San Francisco, but he actually won 10 straight to secure the Mets' first division, first pennant, and then eventually their first World Series. So he was very clutch. Even in 73, when the Mets are mired in last place in August, he actually wins. He goes actually 6-4 over his last 10 starts and helps secure the Mets division pennant, because they win the 73 National League Championship over the Big Red Machine. And then, of course, they lose in Game 7 in that World Series to the Oakland A's. So Seaver had some, even I was looking at 1970. Many people felt that 70 was kind of a down year for Seaver. In 70, the funny thing is, he lost 4 straight in May. But and he went basically into the All-Star game 14-5. Now he finishes 18-12, but he doesn't surrender a lot of earned runs. Actually, he lost 4 of his last 5, 6 of his last 7. But in 1970, he lost 6 of his last 7. He doesn't surrender a lot of runs. So it wasn't necessarily, I shouldn't say it's whose fault and all the rest of it, because Seaver was always, hey, we win as a team, we lose as a team. But Seaver basically did his job. And the funny thing is, I know that Koosman won about 17 games in 69. He comes down to 13 in 70. Seaver went from 25 down to 18. And you figure if they were, well, you can't ever expect a guy to be 25-7 every year. But had they gotten back to where they were, even met it halfway, the Mets would have picked up 5-6 games in the standings instead, and probably would have had 89 or 90 wins. But the funny thing is, they won 100 the year before. So really, the whole Met team really had a downer year in 1970. The funny thing is, everyone thinks that the 73 season was kind of miraculous, and it was to a certain extent. They finished in last place, or they are in last place in August, late August. And actually, the funny thing is, and this is very vivid memory, the Dodgers come in for a couple of games. And I remember being at the game. I believe the Dodgers or the Mets beat them 3-1. And then the next night, my family, and of course, we didn't have a lot of money. My father was a teacher and a principal. But I just remember that as a family, and there were 6 kids in the family and my mom, we decided just on a lark to go to the game. And I'm pretty sure you can look it up, but they're losing to the Dodgers late in the game. And I remember that there was a big LA Dodger fan. He probably comes from the day of the Brooklyn Dodgers. And he's yelling everything out. His daughter is embarrassed, and we're sitting in front. We're kind of laughing, but the Dodgers are winning the game throughout. And then bottom of the ninth comes in, and they basically load the bases, the Mets, and there's an error. I think it was on the shortstop. It might have been Bill Russell, and the Mets score 2 runs and win the game 4-3. And I always felt, now they did lose the next night to the Dodgers, but they won 2 out of 3 against the Dodgers, who were in first place at that time in the National League West, only by about 3 games over the Reds. But the Mets go on a surge. Why I bring this up? Because if you take a look at the 72 season, the Mets do finish in 3rd place. But at one time, the Mets, I think, were 32-14 or 32-18 in their first 50 games. And then the walls caved in. They had a number of injuries, and they did finish over 500, but they weren't the same team. Well, 73 starts, and the Mets seem to be in the same kind of slump. Lots of injuries until August hits, and of course they're in last place. And they have that unbelievable August, those last 6-7 weeks of August and September, where the Mets couldn't be beaten. And I took up to 72, and the Mets had their highest when they had their best record in 72. And I'm pretty sure they were like 32-14 or 32-18. And I took the 7 weeks at the end of the 73 season, and I put the two together because that was when the Mets team were at their healthiest in both those years. The Mets wind up winning like 87 or 88 games. My point being is that 73 team wasn't as amazing. Well, I shouldn't say amazing, but it wasn't that far-fetched that they came out of last place because they had 3 really good pitchers on that staff, plus George Stone having a career year in 73. And it was anchored by Seaver and his 19 wins. You had the funny thing is that Stone and Seaver, I think, were the only 2 guys on that Met staff who were over 500. And you had Matlack, but you had Matlack and Koosman, and Matlack came back from a serious injury to the head. Remember, he got hit in the head by Marty Perez of Atlanta. But they both finished with 14 wins. They're under 500, but I'm telling you that Koosman and Matlack, I'll never understand why Matlack wasn't what I really thought he was going to be. Koosman was a really good pitcher. And really, based on today's metrics, there's no way that by 1978, now this isn't 5 years, that today's probably general manager would have gotten rid of Koosman, Seaver, and Matlack. May have gotten rid of one, but I don't think any GM worth its salt would have gotten rid of all 3. Plus, Matlack and Koosman were lefties. You had 2 lefties in your starting pitching lineup. Actually, 3, because George Stone was a lefty as well. I do believe. All right, so the Mets had 3 really good pitchers, and I'm throwing Stone out, whether he's a lefty or right. I'm throwing him out of the whole thing because he had a career year, he wins the 12. He did his job.